UDL in Action podcast wishes to acknowledge First Nations peoples in Australia and across the world whose songlines traverse the globe. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging whose cultural traditions inspire and continue to educate.
This episode of UDL in Action podcast explores Representation Guideline 1, focusing on how students access information through different senses. Rather than changing what is taught, the emphasis is on how information is delivered so that all students can engage with learning. We will explore practical strategies on how to design lessons that remove barriers and include diverse perspectives. I'm your host, Rebecca Rosenberg. I am joined by our knowledgeable and generous co-host, Rhonda Laswell from Indiana. Rhonda is a retired educator and Universal Design for Learning coordinator. She spent nearly 2 decades immersed in UDL as both a teacher and a professional development coach for educators. We're always so thrilled to have Rhonda share her decades of experience with us in each episode. Rhonda, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. It's always a joy for me as well.
We are joined by Zach, an early career teacher who is currently working in a regional high school in Queensland. Zach is keen to learn more about UDL, and we're committed to helping all educators understand UDL and apply it effectively in their practice. Zach's question for this episode is:
Thinking about Representation Guideline 1, how do I design lessons so all students can access content in different ways and see diverse perspectives? Do you use a specific approach to lesson planning, and can you share some examples of your approach and how it's been successfully applied across learning areas?
I know, Rhonda, we have spoken many times about how we want teachers to approach lesson planning intentionally. I'm keen to hear your ideas and practical strategies that have proven effective across different learning areas. Over to you, Rhonda.
Thank you. I love this guideline for many reasons. One is that I think pre-service teachers and students of educational prep programs probably get more perspectives from their experience in post-secondary on this particular guideline more than any other, right? Because representation, how you're teaching, is something that's always a huge topic. But what I've always found is that what teachers tend to do once they get back in the classroom is they fall back into, well, how they like to be taught is how they teach, right? And so, if a person likes to take notes and hear lecture, that's how they teach. If they like to just read on their own, that's how they teach. So this one's an interesting one. And it's really what I would call also a doormat guideline. So anything on the top row is considered the doormat, the open door into education, and really what the teacher can have the most control over really impacting. That being said, once we get into the layers of representation and perception, we want to give students the opportunity to be able to manipulate that content. So back to Zach's questions. I always had a rule, and it always worked really well for me in my head, and that was allowing my students to have access to what I wanted them to either know or be able to do 7 times 7 different ways. And that should happen before any assessment, especially a summative assessment's done. So when I think about that, just think about, first of all, your senses, right? See, touch, hear, taste. Movement's another big one. Kinesthetically, how can you get people up and moving when you're trying to help them to see, hear, and perceive something? I do think that learning management systems have made this so much easier because you can allow students to just log into a home page for a lesson and they can get access to a video clip, or they can get access to maybe making the print larger, which is always a good thing. But some simple things when I think about entering the classroom and really thinking about baseline, where would I start, would be to make sure that I am really capitalizing on things like font size, color, bold, underline to begin with, right? You want to call attention to certain things more than others. That's a great place to start. Then the other thing is you really want to be able to support students being able to have access from different vantage points or levels, right? So having them be able to not just have the word, but have the picture and then have the definition. And what I often tell people for this guideline is to think about a pre-K or a kindergarten classroom. What would it feel like to walk through that room? What would be labeled? Would it be in more than one language? And there isn't any reason why at the high school level that can't be done as well and should be done. Just because I'm in a high school classroom doesn't mean there can't be a word wall. Just because I'm in a high school classroom doesn't mean my student can't have a personal dictionary where they are keeping track of certain vocabulary words and making sure that they're maybe drawing a picture, writing a definition. Colored pencils are great. Another thing that's really important here is the use of highlighters, right? So if you're going to give students a 15-minute lecture, are you also giving them a printout? Are they getting access to sticky notes? Are they getting access to highlighters so that they can make their experience in interacting with that content really personal on their own? I was observing a fourth grade classroom, I believe it was, fourth or fifth grade classroom a couple of years ago. And it was fascinating to me because it was afternoon and it was warm weather. So picture a really hot fourth or fifth grade classroom, and they're working their way through a novel at like an hour before the school bus is going to take them home and they've had lunch. We can all picture this, right? And these
Most
kids,
definitely.
oh my goodness. So they were in, here's another thing, being in different places in the room and having flexible seating also helps the brain engage better, right? The more comfortable I am. So that's a whole nother layer that we could add to it, right? But the lights were out. It was dim, but there was still sunlight. So lighting's huge. Everybody was in a comfortable spot. She had an old couch in there. So some were on that, some were on their desk, some were on the floor. But all of their books had sticky notes around inside them on different pages and highlighting. And some students were highlighting everything. Some were just doing certain words and they were taking turns reading. And it was a fluid process. And the teacher would stop occasionally and say, now, you know, what's really going on here? Is this really what's happening? What do you think? And then the conversation was just so rich. But because they weren't just handed a book, told to read, and then the next day have a printout of a discussion, they were actually immersed in the process of reading and comprehending. And they were all able to have access at different vantage points. And the other thing, that would be simple to do there too is as you do the pre-reading, if there's some vocabulary words, some students are going to need to have mini lessons on, making sure that there is a printout or a handout or a copy of those words either on a website or on the screen so that it's not an embarrassment to not know a vocabulary word. I think you have to think also about what student may not just have issue with understanding, but also have issue with feeling comfortable asking, right? If they don't know a word. You want to remove that barrier. That barrier should never, ever be there, right? And then I had a friend who was teaching fifth or sixth grade in Florida. And for the first time ever, he had a student who was blind and was using Braille. And I said, okay, so this is a new experience for you. And he's like, oh, yeah. And I said, so I have a question for you, right? So we provide everything for everybody if that's the option. I said, did you ever make it an option for anybody else just to try out Braille or to have Braille available just for the curiosity aspect? And he said, yes. And that was the best part, because you had some students who were fascinated by that and wanted to understand it more. Could I have accessed it that way? Well, of course, it would have taken some lessons and things, but at the same time, it was still part of the environment. So that person doesn't just feel like, oh, it's just for me, right? So you want to think about how you can bring all of that into the environment in a way that it's part of the culture. And when you talk about Zach's question about diverse perspectives, that's what you're doing. You're inviting everyone to the table without judgment. So everyone has the opportunity to sit at the table and to interact. And you may have a back channel running for questions on any kind of platform, but learning management systems are great. You have a kiddo who may not feel comfortable asking a question, but they can key it in on the back channel, right? And so just another way that you can add to that experience of accessing the content.
That's great. There's so much in your response to Zach's question. So, firstly, I loved your analogy or your example of 7 times 7. So, always thinking about how can I teach students via the multiple means of representation 7 times 7 different ways. And that
Absolutely.
gives you so much variety, and that takes into consideration the diversity of needs within the classroom. I love that. And I also,
Absolutely.
yes, yes. And I also love the example, the analogy of, or not, it's not an analogy, your example of the classroom that the reading the story and being absolutely immersed in what they were reading, as opposed to feeling like this is just a story that I have to get through to be able to answer the questions for my assessment task.
Right. Instead of it being an assignment, it was an experience.
Yes, yes. And even being able to sit wherever they wanted in the classroom and annotate and highlight what they wanted to highlight made that experience more authentic. That's excellent. And finally, well, not finally, but one other point that you made is providing that opportunity for students to ask questions in a comfortable and safe environment via different platforms. So, what are different ways that you have encouraged teachers to implement opportunities for students in their classes to ask questions, as opposed to, I mean, putting your hand up and asking a question is a very appropriate method, but what other
Absolutely.
options have you seen?
So there are there are ways that you can also navigate questions that need to be asked now and questions that can be held for later too, right? So a lot of different ways. One is the back channel, which is always great because then it's just running and you can see it if you have a couple different screens up. The other one is obviously raising a hand. That's always good. The other one that I think is really good is to ask somebody in your group or your partner first. So who have I asked first before I ask the teacher? Have you used your resources and have you asked a friend? Because a lot of times the collective knowledge of the group is, very powerful, obviously, and the teacher doesn't, that also helps students see the teacher doesn't hold all the knowledge and all the power. Right. So that's another good way. Another one I like is a parking lot, and that can be, I love setting students up to work in a group, but they don't always have to be doing group work. So you can do your shoulder partner, you can do your group, or you can do individual. So you can have a parking lot at the group where they put it on sticky and put it in the parking lot, or you can have it up at the whiteboard and they put it in the parking lot. And then you can walk over occasionally and look at those. Another one that I really like is having 3 different color cups. I like red, green, and blue. And green is nobody in our group right now has a question or needs any assistance. Blue is we need some help, but it's not like keeping us from going forward. We just would like to ask you something. And red is, oh my goodness, we're stuck. And a teacher can very easily scan the room and see everybody's on green. I got one on red. I got one on blue. And that is also very low threshold for stress for students. And then they're not like, this after 4 or 5 minutes, right? I'm not kidding. We've all seen that. And what happens then? They stop working. They're not doing anything but trying to get your attention. That should not be how they're spending their time. So obviously raising a hand's great, but there are so many other ways to do it that are more efficient and effective for the teacher and the student.
And again, just such a diverse way for students to be able to ask questions in a very safe and non-threatening way. That's great. That's so good. And when you're talking about the chat, are you referring to students on a laptop asking questions onto the screen? Is that what you meant?
So well, you could have it set up so that they could do it to the screen and it could be seen, of course, but you could also have it so that it's just directly to the teacher. So and here's the other thing, you do both. So if I have a student who I'm working on this with, I might start out with them just sending it to me because most learning management systems have built in a way for them to message the teacher or to message the group in a group chat, right? And so you can set up the classroom as a group chat, but you could also have them instant message. The goal would be, right, to progress them to a point where they could put something in the parking lot or ask a friend or a neighbor. Again, what we're always trying to do is teach students how to learn in a learning culture and not just learn in isolation. So anything that you can do to move them forward in their comfort in the learning process is always very, very beneficial. But you
And
don't
the,
want a student to not ask just because they don't feel comfortable.
And these are all things that we can plan as
Absolutely.
prior to our lesson taking place, which is going back to what Zach's question was as well.
And the other thing I would point out too with this particular guideline is that it's a great place to start with students in teaching them about the learning process and UDL themselves. They need to know the vocabulary of learning. They need to know the vernacular of universal design. They need to understand that well too, so that you can say to them, I know some of you prefer the video clip. Some of you are going to prefer this object lesson. Some of you are going to just say, hey, teacher, can I just go in the corner and read about this? Some of you want to hear me explain it. So, these first month or two of school, I'm going to point these different ways out to you. And I want you to be thinking about what you appreciate and enjoy. And then once you know what your favorite is, I want you to really push yourself to try the other ones out and really focus in on all the different ways that we have access to content and information. And of course, you make that grade level appropriate. You wouldn't do things 7 times, 7 different ways with a kindergartner, right? The first day. But you work them up to those things and you're teaching them that process. Absolutely. And that it's okay to not prefer something. You don't have to like everything that's going on.
But at the same time, it's so important for us as teachers to expose students to those other platforms or those other methods so that they may one day choose to go down an avenue that's not necessarily what was their preferred way to go previously.
So a perfect example of this was my daughter when she was in nursing school. She had a lot of lecture-rich instruction. And I just said to her one day, I said, you're just going to have to be your own teacher. You know what they want you to know. I said, now I want you to go out on YouTube or some other platform. And when you hear a lecture, then I want you to go in and watch videos of examples and explanations that are done more like a cartoon or, something that's more like geared towards someone who needs more visual, rich instruction. And that's what she did. And it really provided that layer. Now, would it have been nice had that happened for her, have been provided and she didn't have to hunt those down? Yes. But sometimes, you have to be your own teacher. And so I don't want students to ever feel like that they have to do that. I would rather them experience it in the classroom and be able to say, wow, I learned today because not, you want to remove those barriers for everyone.
That's great. That's great. UDL isn't about doing more. It's about designing smarter with intention and empathy, which is what you have given us such wonderful examples of throughout this podcast, Rhonda. You don't need to be an expert in UDL to begin applying it. If you're thinking about barriers and providing options and designing with learners in mind, you're already moving in the right direction. Rhonda, thank you once again for your wisdom and sharing your knowledge of how to put UDL into practice. Before we wrap up, what's one takeaway you'd like our listeners to walk away with?
I think that it goes back to if we are really designing intentionally, then when content is given to students or provided for students, it is a experience. It's not an assignment. So I want students to experience learning instead of feel like they're being acted upon by an outside force, right? I want them to be part of the process. So I always want them to feel like what they're learning is not an assignment, it's an experience.
An experience, most certainly. Thank you for tuning in. If today's episode sparked ideas or reflections, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at udl.in.action.podcast@gmail.com. And if you'd like the show notes or resources mentioned, just click on the link at the end of each episode description to our G Drive folder for listeners. And please share our podcast with your colleagues through YouTube or Spotify. Until next time, keep designing for possibility, not predictability.
Toodaloo.
Bye.